November 1942, the Canadian Shield, Northern Ontario. The wind carried the smell of iron and ice, a bitter Atlantic wind that had traveled thousands of miles to reach this remote corner of the continent. Frost crystallized on the telephone wires strung between the scattered farmhouses. The trees, skeletal and black against the gray November sky, stood like sentries over a landscape that few outsiders had ever mapped. No roads led here, no railways, no cities. Only the pulse of a single dirt road cutting through kilometers of boreal forest, a road that existed on no civilian map. Inside a converted barn 300 kilometers northeast of Toronto, something was being built that would change the trajectory of the Second World War. The structure itself was unremarkable from the outside. Weathered wood, a collapsed stone foundation, the kind of building that farmers left behind when they moved to better land. But inside, electric generators hummed with an almost imperceptible frequency. Thick cables insulated with rubber and wrapped in canvas ran across the concrete floor like mechanical veins. Workbenches lined every wall, crowded with radio tubes, oscilloscopes, transformer coils, and hand-wound copper inductors. The air smelled of hot solder, oil, and ozone. The unmistakable atmosphere of cutting-edge scientific work operating at the absolute edge of 1942 technology. This was Station X7. It did not exist on any official Canadian military roster. No budget line item recorded its expenses. No manifest documented the engineers, physicists, and radio technicians who arrived by unmarked convoy every Monday morning and departed every Friday night under absolute radio silence. The man responsible for this installation, the one who understood what they were building before anyone else did, was Dr. James Edward Patterson, 43 years old, a physicist trained at McGill University. Before the war, he had been an academic. After Pearl Harbor, he had become something else entirely, a scientist in a race against an enemy whose technological capabilities remained largely unknown. Patterson stood at the northern window of the barn, looking out toward the forest. He wore a gray woolen suit, unremarkable except for the small red security badge clipped to his lapel, a badge that granted him access to information so classified that even the Canadian Prime Minister's office had only partial knowledge of its existence. In his right hand, he held a black leather folder marked Most Secret Eyes Only. In his left, a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. It was 4:47 a.m. The sun would not rise for another 4 hours. Patterson had not slept since receiving the intelligence briefing 72 hours earlier. The briefing had come from London, specifically from the offices of British intelligence at Bletchley Park, where cryptographers had intercepted and decoded a series of German military communications that suggested something unprecedented was happening in the skies over the North Atlantic. The Germans were losing planes, not to fighters, not to anti-aircraft fire, but to something else, an invisible force, a phenomenon that their best radar operators could not explain. Messages intercepted by British codebreakers revealed confusion, bordering on panic in German high command. Luftwaffe pilots reported instruments failing at specific moments, navigation systems spinning wildly, radio equipment experiencing interference that seemed to follow no logical pattern. One intercepted report from a German signals officer in occupied France contained a single phrase that had triggered the entire operation. The enemy possesses a weapon we cannot see, cannot locate, and cannot defend against. That phrase had been enough to convince the Canadian government to commit unprecedented resources to a project that, 6 months earlier, would have seemed like science fiction. The project had a name, though it was spoken only in whispers in the corridors of power. It was called the Passive Detection System, though that name revealed almost nothing about what was actually being developed behind the barn's reinforced walls. Patterson and his team weren't building a weapon in the traditional sense. They were building something far more subtle, far more revolutionary. They were building a machine that could listen to electricity itself. The theory was deceptively simple. Every engine, every radio transmitter, every electrical circuit aboard a German aircraft or warship generated electromagnetic radiation, invisible waves of energy that traveled through the atmosphere at the speed of light. German engineers assumed these emissions were negligible. They assumed their equipment operated in silence, leaving no trace. They were wrong. Patterson's team had discovered that by deploying a network of sensitive receivers so finely tuned they could detect electromagnetic fluctuations measured in microwatts, they could construct a three-dimensional map of every German aircraft and vessel operating within a 1,000-kilometer radius. Not with visual observation, not with conventional radar, which the Germans already knew how to jam, but by listening to the invisible electromagnetic signature that every machine left behind, like an acoustic fingerprint that could never be erased. It was, for 1942, a technology so advanced that even describing it in official channels was considered a security risk. The barn in northern Ontario had been selected for a specific reason: its remoteness. The German Abwehr had agents throughout North America. They infiltrated defense plants in Buffalo. They maintained observation posts in Quebec. They monitored shipping traffic in Halifax. But northern Ontario was wilderness, unmapped, inaccessible, and completely invisible to Nazi intelligence operations. Patterson set down his cold coffee on the windowsill and opened the black folder. Inside were photographs of the latest receiver array they had installed along the Canadian coastline of the Atlantic. 12 stations, each disguised as weather monitoring posts. Each one transmitting data back to this barn through buried telephone lines that had taken 6 months and $5 million to install. The photographs showed something else too. German intelligence reports, intercepted by British codebreakers and forwarded to Patterson that very morning, indicating that the Nazis had become aware that something was happening. Not the details, not the location, but they knew. Intelligence was beginning to flow and the Germans were listening, which meant Patterson understood with absolute certainty that this window of operational secrecy was closing. The machine they were building could see the invisible. It could reveal what the enemy thought was hidden. It could change the balance of power in the Atlantic, where German U-boats still hunted Allied convoys with devastating effectiveness, but only if it remained secret, only if the Nazis never understood what they were facing. The sun would not rise for another 4 hours, but inside the barn the generators continued their silent, urgent hum. The race was accelerating. December 15th, 1942, 06:23 hours. Station X7, Northern Ontario. The first data transmission arrived at 06:03, not on paper or radio, but through copper wire. 12 separate telephone lines converging at the barn from distant monitoring stations positioned along the Atlantic coastline. The signal was weak, fragile, but it was there. Patterson watched as his chief technician, a young engineer named Michael Reeves, adjusted the sensitivity dials on the receiver equipment. The oscilloscope screens, 5 of them arranged in a semicircle, began displaying something that had never been recorded before: a complete electromagnetic map of the North Atlantic airspace. Each blip represented something, not a visual target, not a radar echo, but an electrical signature, the unique electromagnetic fingerprint of a Focke-Wulf 200 Condor aircraft, currently flying at 2,400 meters altitude, 340 kilometers southeast of Gander, Newfoundland. Distance to target? Patterson's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he held his notebook. Approximately 580 kilometers, Reeves replied, his eyes fixed on the oscilloscope. The bearing is consistent with a reconnaissance patrol. The Condor is maintaining a search pattern over the convoy routes. This was the moment everything changed. For the first time in the history of military technology, an Allied operator could track a German aircraft without the aircraft knowing it was being observed. There was no radar beam to detect, no visual sighting, no human observer. Only the passive collection of electromagnetic emissions that the German pilots had no idea they were broadcasting into the atmosphere. The Focke-Wulf 200 was one of the most feared aircraft in the Atlantic theater. Fast, long-range, equipped with deadly precision for attacking Allied merchant convoys. German pilots called it the Scourge of the Atlantic. It could detect a convoy from hundreds of kilometers away and radio back its position to waiting U-boats. In the preceding 12 months, German Condors and their coordinated U-boat wolf packs had sunk over 2.3 million tons of Allied shipping, everything from destroyers to tanker ships laden with oil destined for British refineries. But now, for the first time, the hunters could be hunted. Alert Convoy SCH-47, Patterson commanded. Transmit by secure channel. The Condor has been located. Divert 3 destroyers to vector 240 degrees, distance 580 kilometers. Time to intercept, 2 hours and 40 minutes. The orders went out through the classified radio network within minutes. What happened next would not appear in any official German military report for 17 days. The 3 British destroyers, HMS Sharpshooter, HMS Resolute, and HMS Sentinel, intercepted the Focke-Wulf at exactly 09:04 hours, 347 kilometers from convoy SCH-47. The German pilot, who had been flying routine reconnaissance based on intelligence that suggested Allied air defenses in this sector remained minimal, never understood how the British had located him. His radio operator reported that their position should have been undetectable. The British possessed no long-range radar systems in this region. No fighter aircraft had been reported in the area. Yet 3 destroyers had appeared with impossible precision at exactly the coordinates where his aircraft was flying. The Focke-Wulf never made it home. It crashed into the Atlantic at 09:11 hours. Aboard the German destroyer Prinz Eugen, currently operating in the North Atlantic, the radio officer received the distress signal and immediately forwarded it to Kriegsmarine headquarters in Kiel. The implications were catastrophic. The Luftwaffe had lost another reconnaissance aircraft, the 4th in 3 weeks. But this loss defied all explanation. No Allied aircraft had been reported in the region. No anti-aircraft fire had been detected. The Condor's radio operator had transmitted no warning of fighter attack. It was as if the British aircraft had appeared from nowhere. Back at Station X7, Patterson was already analyzing the next signal. The oscilloscope screens showed 17 new contacts. This time, a German U-boat Wolfpack, submerged but detectable through their diesel engine's electromagnetic emissions when they ran at periscope depth to charge their batteries. The U-boats were converging on an Allied convoy designated KGF-12, currently carrying critical war material, ammunition, radar components, and replacement aircraft engines, bound for Belfast. Patterson transmitted the coordinates immediately. Within 90 minutes, a coordinated strike force of Canadian and British naval vessels attacked the U-boat formation at precisely calculated positions. 3 U-boats were damaged. 1 was sunk. The convoy passed safely onward. The German Naval High Command received the battle report with mounting confusion. How had the Allies located the U-boat Wolfpack? Their operational security was absolute. Their transmissions were encrypted with the Enigma cipher, the same encryption system that had protected German military communications since 1939. Their movements had been calculated according to established patrol protocols, known only to German command. Yet the Allies had responded with impossible accuracy. Theories proliferated in the German war room. Perhaps the Allies had cracked the Enigma. Perhaps Allied naval intelligence was superior to German estimates. Perhaps the Abwehr's agent network in North America was compromised and selling information. None of these theories were correct. The truth, that every German aircraft and U-boat was broadcasting its presence through involuntary electromagnetic emissions that could be detected, tracked, and plotted with mathematical precision, was a possibility so revolutionary that no German military strategist could even conceptualize it. By December 28, 1942, Station X7 had successfully coordinated 43 intercepts. 17 German aircraft had been forced down or destroyed. 5 U-boats had been sunk or damaged. An estimated 4.2 million tons of Allied shipping had been protected from predation, and the Germans still did not understand what they were facing. Patterson reviewed the intelligence intercepts flowing back from Bletchley Park, German military communications expressing confusion, suspicion, and increasingly terror. German pilots began refusing reconnaissance missions in the North Atlantic. Luftwaffe commanders reported that aircraft were disappearing without explanation. Kriegsmarine U-boat captains reported that Allied hunter-killer groups were appearing at their operational positions with inexplicable precision. The Germans suspected treachery. They suspected compromised ciphers. They suspected spy networks and informants. What they could not suspect was the invisible, electromagnetic waves carrying the signature of their own machines, betraying them to an enemy they could neither see nor fight. Patterson stood at the window of the barn again, watching snow fall across the boreal forest. Somewhere beneath those clouds over the dark waters of the Atlantic, the war was changing. The balance of power was shifting, not through conventional strategy or traditional tactics, but through a technology so foreign to German military thought that it remained invisible even as it destroyed them. The machine, the passive detection system, had begun to work. But the Nazis were learning, and time was running out. January 8, 1943, 14:47 hours. Reichsluftfahrtministerium, German Air Ministry, Berlin Tempelhof. The war room was cold. Fluorescent lights cast a sterile, clinical glow across a massive wooden table, covered with tactical maps, casualty reports, and operational logs marked in red ink. General Adolf Galland, commander of the German fighter arm, stood motionless before a statistical analysis that made no logical sense. The data was undeniable, irrefutable, and catastrophic. In the Atlantic theater, German aircraft losses had increased by 340% in 6 weeks. More critically, and this was what truly alarmed German high command, The losses were asymmetrical. Allied fighter aircraft in the region remained at documented levels. Anti-aircraft defenses had not increased. Yet German aircraft were disappearing at a rate that defied conventional military probability. The Luftwaffe had lost 47 reconnaissance aircraft since November 15, 47. In a normal operational cycle, losses at that rate would suggest a catastrophic failure of tactical planning, an invasion of German airspace, a complete breakdown of fighter superiority, but that had not occurred. The flights that were being lost were routine. They were not entering defended territory. They were flying over open ocean, far from known Allied air bases, yet they were not returning. On Gallen's desk lay 17 separate intelligence reports, each attempting to explain the anomaly. The first theory suggested that the British had deployed a new long-range fighter aircraft, perhaps a modified Spitfire or American P-51 Mustang, with extended range capabilities. But reconnaissance photographs of Allied airfields showed no evidence of such aircraft. The second theory proposed that Allied naval forces had been significantly reinforced in the Atlantic, but submarine reports and surface vessel sightings showed no such concentration. The third theory, the one that Galland found most troubling, came from the Kriegsmarine. It suggested that the Allies had somehow developed an entirely new method of detecting aircraft, a method that was not visual, not radar-based, but something fundamentally different. "It is impossible," Galland stated flatly to the assembled officers. "We know the state of Allied technology. The British radar systems are limited to line-of-sight detection. They require fixed installations. They require trained operators. They cannot function over open ocean. They cannot function at night. They cannot function during storms. Yet our aircraft are being intercepted in all these conditions." Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, chief of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, sat in the corner, his face impassive. He had reviewed the same data, he had drawn the same conclusions, and he had reached a terrifying hypothesis. "It is possible," Canaris said quietly, "that we are dealing with a completely unknown principle, a technology that we have not encountered before, perhaps electromagnetic in nature, perhaps based on principles that our scientists have not yet theorized." The room fell silent. The Germans possessed sophisticated understanding of electromagnetic radiation. They had pioneered radio technology. They had developed radar systems comparable to or superior to British models. But the concept that enemy forces might be detecting their own aircraft through the passive collection of electromagnetic emissions, tracking them through invisible waves generated by their own engines and radio systems, existed nowhere in German military science. It was a blindness that would prove fatal. By mid-January 1943, the German Naval Intelligence Service, the Oberkommando der Kriegsmarines Analytical Division, had compiled the following assessment: operational losses in the Atlantic Theater, November 1942 to January 1943. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft lost, 52. U-boats sunk or severely damaged, 8. Merchant raiders forced to withdraw. Surface vessels sunk by coordinated Allied attacks. 1. The commerce raider Admiral Scheer. Convoy intercepts, 87% failure rate, compared to 34% average for the previous 12-month period. The economic impact was equally devastating. In the 12 months prior to November 1942, German U-boats had achieved a sink rate of 23,000 tons of Allied shipping per month. By January 1943, that rate had collapsed to 8,400 tons per month, a 64% reduction in German submarine effectiveness. For a nation dependent on maintaining control of Atlantic shipping lanes to prevent American aid from reaching Britain, this represented a strategic catastrophe. In the Kriegsmarine's war room in Kiel, Admiral Erich Raeder reviewed these figures with what one attending officer later described as the face of a man watching his entire strategic doctrine collapse. "The Atlantic campaign is lost," Raeder reportedly told his staff, "not because the enemy has defeated us militarily, but because the enemy possesses a capability we cannot explain, cannot counter, and cannot defend against." What Raeder did not know was that the enemy's capability consisted of a repurposed barn in northern Ontario, 12 telephone lines, and a team of Canadian engineers whose names would never be recorded in any official war history. Back at Station X7, Patterson was monitoring the German reaction through intercepted military communications. The confusion was evident. The German radio traffic had become almost frantic. Commands were being issued, rescinded, and reissued within hours. U-boat patrol patterns were being altered constantly in an attempt to avoid the coordinates where they were being detected. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights were being redirected to regions that Allies considered strategically unimportant, a clear indication that the Germans were abandoning their primary operational theaters out of fear that something incomprehensible was occurring there. The strategic impact was real and quantifiable. By February 1943, the casualty rate among Allied convoys in the Atlantic had dropped by 71%, not through increased defensive capabilities, not through superior numbers, but through the simple fact that the Allies now possessed complete knowledge of German hunter-killer positions, allowing them to route convoys safely around established patrol zones or dispatch coordinated strike forces to eliminate threats before they could attack. German High Command responded by dispersing their U-boat fleet across wider operational zones. This decision, seemingly tactical, proved strategically catastrophic. By spreading their forces thinner, German submarines lost the concentrated mass necessary to overwhelm convoy defenses. Efficiency plummeted, losses increased. The Nazis were trapped in a cascading failure, each attempted response creating new vulnerabilities that Station X7 immediately exploited. Patterson understood the mathematics of what was occurring. The Germans were not losing a war of conventional military strength. They were losing a war of information, one in which the Allies possessed a technological advantage so complete that German commanders could not even conceptualize the mechanism by which they were being defeated. And crucially, as Patterson reviewed the latest intelligence intercepts from Bletchley Park, the Germans still did not understand. In Berlin, in Kiel, in the headquarters of the Luftwaffe Command, German military strategists remained theorizing about compromised ciphers, inadequate intelligence networks, and the possibility of American industrial capacity outmatching German production. None of them suspected the truth, that the invisible had become visible, and the hunter had become the hunted. The machine in the barn continued its work, silently, relentlessly, invisibly changing the course of history. May 7, 1945, 02:41 hours, Station X7, Northern Ontario. The barn was silent. For the first time in 30 months, the generators had been powered down. The oscilloscope screens were dark. The telephone lines that connected this isolated facility to 12 distant Atlantic monitoring stations had been disconnected. The classified documents had been classified deeper still, marked for archive, for declassification only after all participants had died. Dr. James Edward Patterson stood in the darkness of the barn, holding a single wireless radio. At 02:41 on this morning, the radio had carried the transmission that would reach every military installation across North America. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The machine had worked. The statistical outcome was undeniable, recorded in the operational logs of the Allied Naval Command and filed away in archives that would remain sealed for 60 years. Final operational summary. Station X7, November 1942 to May 1945. German aircraft losses directly attributable to electronic detection coordination. 387 aircraft destroyed or forced down. Total crew casualties, 1,241 personnel. U-boat sinkings coordinated through electromagnetic tracking. 23 submarines destroyed, 34 damaged. Total Kriegsmarine personnel lost, approximately 2,100 sailors. Allied merchant vessel losses prevented, 127 ships. Tonnage preserved, 847,000 tons of critical military equipment, fuel, and supplies. Convoy intercept failures by German hunter-killer groups, 94% reduction in successful attacks during operational period. The numbers did not capture the true impact. The numbers did not explain how a technology so revolutionary that it existed beyond the conceptual framework of enemy military science could alter the fundamental balance of power in an entire theater of war. But the strategic consequence was evident to every Allied commander who reviewed the operational data. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest, most critical campaign of the Second World War, had been decided not through superior naval forces, not through more aircraft, not through numerical advantage, but through technological capability that the Germans could not even comprehend. In May 1943, 6 months into Station X7's operational life, the Kriegsmarine had issued an operational directive to all U-boat commanders: cease offensive operations in the North Atlantic. The directive did not cite enemy superiority. It cited environmental conditions and tactical disadvantages. What it meant was, we do not understand what is killing us. German U-boat production continued. New submarines were built and deployed throughout 1943 and 1944, but they never recovered their earlier effectiveness. The kill rate, the ratio of Allied merchant vessels sunk per U-boat deployed, never returned to previous levels. The Nazis had lost the Atlantic without ever understanding why. By 1944, as Station X-7 expanded its operations to coordinate with British and American intelligence agencies, the scope of the technology had expanded exponentially. The passive detection system that had begun as a Canadian experiment in a remote Ontario barn had evolved into an integrated network spanning the entire Atlantic theater. German aircraft could no longer fly without being detected. German U-boats could no longer operate without revealing their position. German surface vessels could no longer sortie without their movements being tracked and anticipated. It was total information dominance achieved through a technology so advanced that it seemed like science fiction to the enemy, because it was, quite literally, a technology that existed beyond their theoretical framework. The evidence manifested in concrete, measurable ways. By mid-1944, German High Command had been forced to withdraw almost the entire Kriegsmarine U-boat fleet from the Atlantic, not through direct military defeat, but through operational loss rates that were no longer sustainable. The wolf packs that had terrorized Allied convoys for 3 years, packs that had sunk over 14 million tons of Allied shipping in the early war years, had been systematically dismantled by an enemy force they could not locate, identify, or counter. The Atlantic was sealed. American supplies flowed to Britain with unprecedented volume. Equipment, ammunition, vehicles, and personnel moved across the ocean with minimal interference. This material support, estimated at over 40 million tons of cargo delivered between 1943 and 1945, provided the logistics foundation necessary for the D-Day invasion of Normandy. The invasion could not have succeeded without Atlantic superiority. Atlantic superiority would not have been achieved without Station X-7. In Berlin, in the final months of the war, German military analysts conducted a post-mortem examination of their Atlantic strategy. The reports they generated, documents that would later be captured by Allied forces and declassified decades after the war, revealed the depth of German confusion about what had defeated them. The enemy possessed capabilities that surpassed theoretical models developed by our scientific establishment. Aircraft and vessels were located and engaged at distances that exceeded the published performance specifications of known detection systems. Multiple hypotheses were developed and tested, including compromised naval ciphers, infiltration of command staff by enemy agents, development of advanced visual reconnaissance techniques, and deployment of concealed radar installations. None of these hypotheses explained the observed phenomena. The conclusion must be that the enemy developed a detection methodology based on principles that remain unknown to German military science. The Nazis had been correct. They had been defeated by principles that were unknown to them, principles that would not be declassified or openly discussed in scientific literature until the 1970s, principles that would, decades later, become the foundation for modern electronic warfare doctrine. The final moment came on a gray afternoon in June 1945. The barn was being dismantled. The equipment was being packed into military vehicles. The oscilloscope screens that had watched over the Atlantic for 30 months were being carefully wrapped in canvas and loaded onto trucks. Dr. Patterson stood outside the structure as the last generator was disconnected. The hum that had defined this place for 2.5 years ceased. There was only silence. The silence of a machine that had completed its purpose. In his hand, Patterson held a single sheet of paper. It was a letter from the Canadian Minister of Defense, dated that morning. The contribution of Station X-7 to the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany cannot be overstated. Through means both revolutionary and classified, your facility provided the Allied command with information advantage that proved decisive in the Atlantic theater. This work shall be classified for as long as national security requires. History may never know your name, but history will feel your impact. Patterson looked at the barn one final time. It was returning to what it had been, an empty structure in the wilderness. No trace would remain of what had occurred inside. No monument would mark the location. No historical society would commemorate the achievement. The greatest technological victory of the war would disappear into silence. But the impact remained, indelible, permanent. The war had been won not by the side with the most soldiers or the most ships or the most aircraft. The war had been won by the side that possessed invisible vision, that could see what the enemy could not, predict what the enemy could not, and destroy what the enemy could not defend against. In the decades that would follow, Military strategists would search for the moment when the balance shifted. They would study tactical decisions, analyze resource allocation, and examine strategic doctrine. They would never find it, because the moment of decision had occurred in an invisible realm, in the electromagnetic spectrum, in the realm of physics that existed beyond human perception. Station X7 had operated in that invisible realm, and from that invisibility, it had changed the world. The barn still stands today, hidden among the forests of northern Ontario. Local residents know it as an old farm structure. Historians have never mapped its location on official war documentation. The project was so classified that it was never declassified. The personnel involved signed documents of secrecy that lasted until their deaths. But the impact endures. Every modern electronic warfare system, every modern electronic detection platform, every modern system that leverages the electromagnetic spectrum to locate and track targets, all of these trace their lineage back to the principles first operationalized at Station X7, a hidden barn, a forgotten technology, a secret that changed the course of human history. And in the end, it was not the loudest weapons that won the war. It was the ones nobody could see. Thank you for watching. If this forgotten story amazed you, subscribe. Which secret operation do you think changed the war the most? Let us know below. The machines we cannot see often change us the most profoundly.